Capturing events with JavaScript. Events happen. Users will click on something, they'll scroll the page, they'll submit a form. Events happen on web pages. And when events happen, JavaScript can capture them, and then they can do something with those events. When we combine this with manipulating the document, like we saw in the previous lesson, this is where a lot of the power of JavaScript really happens. Once we've talked about how to capture events and handle them, you have all of the basic pieces of the puzzle to make interactive web pages, because we can use our logic flow structures, sequence selection, loop, along with our document methods and our element methods and properties to change elements on the page when events happen. And that's how we can get interactive web pages. Let's take a look at this very basic example. Here I have a web page with a button on it. And when you click the button, it's going to pop up an alert saying that you click the button, something that shows that you actually clicked the button. So let's go over and do this and try this out. Here you can see I have a web page. I have a button on the web page. It says "Don't press me." And I'm going to grab that button using my document element methods. So I'm going to make a variable var btn, and I'm going to assign it document.querySelector. Button. And that'll get that button. There's only one button on the page, so it's easy to get that one button. And it's going to assign it to btn there. And then I'm going to make a function. Remember, we talked about functions. I'm going to make a function called ouch. And all that function's going to do is do an alert. I told you not to press me. You can put whatever you want in there. That's fine. And then I'm going to say, okay, btn.onClick, run this function, ouch. So that's going to actually run a function using on the button. And we're using here a special property that will capture the click event. So let's do that really quickly. Let's see if this works. If I come over here and refresh the page, if I click "Don't press me," I get an alert that says I told you not to press me. So I'm capturing that event of the clicking of the button. And the way I'm capturing that event is with the onClick property. One thing to notice is that I define this function, and when I assign the function to that property, notice I don't put the parentheses at the end here. If I did, then that function would run right away. It would run immediately. So if I put parentheses here, you'll notice that it's not going to wait for me to click. Instead, it's going to run right away. So if I come over here and refresh this page, you'll see I get the alert without even clicking the button. So when I use the event property with the function that I've created this way, I do not add the parentheses for the function there. I just reference that function by name, ouch. And it will then run that function when the event runs. Now, you don't have to define a function here. We can actually just use an anonymous function here. So I could say function, parentheses, curly braces, and just stick the alert in here. And get rid of this altogether. And frequently, when you're using something like this, you're only going to run this on this particular button in this circumstance. So there's not really a reason to create a named function that you could use over and over again in this case, if you're only going to run this in this one case here. But let's see if this works. refresh, don't press me, and I'm getting the alert. So I can use the anonymous function to do that. The onClick event property is useful, but a more frequent method that you'll see of capturing events is using the add event listener method. This is a great way of capturing events because you can capture all kinds of events with the add event listener method. You can even tell it what type of event you want it to capture. And what's really great about it is you can actually put multiple event listeners on one element, whereas with the event property, you can only put one, you can only be listening for one thing at a time. So here, I'm going to go back to our version of with the function ouch and the alert in there, and then we'll use the add event listener instead. So let's give that a try really quickly over here. So instead of using the onClick event for button btn, instead of onClick, that event property, I'm going to use the add event listener method. And notice the difference between the two. The onClick property is a property because it's onClick and then an equal sign and what you're assigning to it. With add event listener, it's a method because it's got parentheses. And we're going to pass in a click. That's the event we're listening for. And then we're going to pass in the function that we're going to run when that event happens. And this is a very much more modern way of doing things, is using the add event listener method here. So let's see if that works. And sure enough, it works just the same as before. The most common syntax is to use the add event listener with an anonymous function. So it kind of combines the two that we looked at before. So let's take a look at that instead. So down here, instead of running the function here, ouch, we're going to put in an anonymous function with its parentheses and curly braces. And this function is going to run when the click happens. And in here, inside the curly braces is what it's going to do. So we're going to put in there the alert. Stick that in there. And then we don't need this function at all. So you can see that we're running this function starts here and ends over there. We're going to run that function, that anonymous function. And again, we use an anonymous function because unless you're going to be running this alert on lots of buttons, in which case then it does make sense to pull it out and turn it into a separate function. But unless you're going to do that, you're probably only going to use it within the context of this particular button. And in that case, an anonymous function is more appropriate. So we can save that. I'm going to come back and let's just test it one more time, refresh the page, don't press me, and I get my alert. So that works great. Now, this syntax, this line is getting kind of long here. Usually you would break it after the curly brace. And then this curly brace could come down here. Notice when I type this, one last thing I want to show you before we go. I'm going to do it again. Notice when I type it from the outside in. So I type my function with the parentheses and the curly braces, and then I come in here and I add my alert or whatever I want to have happen inside this function here. Because with doing this, you're going to end up with a bunch of extra punctuation here, and it's really easy to get confused. And if you lose a curly brace or a parenthesis or a semicolon or something else, it's really hard to, those problems are some of the harder ones to track down. And you'll have fewer problems, you'll be less frustrated if you do it this way, where you always type from the outside in. So when I add a function, I type its parentheses and curly braces, and then go inside and put in what I want to put in here. Okay, so that will really help you with making sure that your syntax is clean and that it's going to have fewer errors. The next thing to look at is the event object. The event object can be passed into the function that runs when an event listener happens. And it's a very useful object to have access to. Let's take a look and see what it does. So over here, I'm in my event listener here, and I have this function here. And I could still do my alert here, alert. I told you not to press me, or whatever I want to put in there. But I can also put in, I can pass in the event object. And sometimes it comes in looking like this. This is just a variable that represents this event object. And I can pass that in, and I can do event.target. So event target will say, what is the thing that triggered this event? Event target dot style dot background color equals red, something like that. Let's see what this does. If I come over and run this, refresh my page, don't press me, it does that and sets the background of the button to red, which is very interesting there. So what's going on here is we can use the event object and the event target to actually know which element was triggering this event. And then we can do something with that event target. And this is often very useful. Now, this thing is just a variable. Sometimes you will see this. If you look around on Stack Overflow, you'll see people pass it in as EVT, in which case this would be EVT. Or sometimes you'll see just E. E, that's fine. It's kind of nice and short. You could call it whatever you want. It represents, call it chickens if you want to. It doesn't make sense to call it chickens. Chickens target style doesn't really make any sense. So usually event makes sense, or EVT or E, but you'll see it represented in different ways. If you look around on the web, if you look at Stack Overflow, you'll see people putting in different values for that event. But the thing that we're passing in here is the event object, just to be really clear about that. One of the ways the event object is used most frequently is to prevent default behavior. And this is especially true when we're working with forms and with the submission of forms. We want to prevent the default submission of the form so that we can do something with that form data before it's submitted. And so we'll use that frequently. But let's just take a look at a really simple example of this here. So if I go over to my code editor over here, I have just a link to Google here. Just a normal anchor tag with an href going to Google. And down here I have a variable link, document query selector A is going to go into my document and find the first anchor tag that it finds, which is the only one on the page. And then I've got attached to that link, add event listener. When you click, pass in the event. And we'll use the event object in combination with event prevent default, the prevent default method, to keep that default method from happening, the default action from happening. In this case, we won't go to Google. So I could do alert. Sorry, no Google for you. Something like that, or whatever you like. So now if I test this page and I come over to my events page and refresh here, I now have a link to Google, and when I click it, I get sorry, no Google for you, and the page does not go to Google. But it's really the event prevent default that's keeping it from going to Google. If I were to come back and comment this line out here, you'll see what we get over here. If I refresh, I get the sorry, no Google for you, but then it'll actually go to Google, okay? Because the event prevent default is needed in order to keep that default event from happening. So this is a particularly useful function that we can use with the event object is prevent default. And we'll be using that frequently in a number of our projects. There's a lot more on events. And if you want another take on the basics, you could go to this MDN Web Docs page on Introduction to Events. I'll put the link in with the lesson so you can click it and look through this page. And this page gives you a very thorough overview of events and the way they work in JavaScript. And some of the more advanced things that they get into, like bubbling and propagation and all this kind of stuff, we'll look at later in the course. But this will give you a thorough introduction to events in JavaScript here as well. What we're going to do next is actually capture some different types of events and see what we can do with them in JavaScript. So the first one we'll look at is the submission of a form. So let's take a look at this example really quickly in the code over here. And I recommend that you actually type these out and save them because they're going to be really helpful to come back to when you do the event challenges coming up, or for some of our other projects, it'll be helpful for you to have these little small scripts to reference to see how to do things later. So I recommend typing them out. So here I am over here. I've got a form on my page here, and it's set to method get. We'll see why in a few minutes here. And down here, I'm going to just get my form and stick it into a variable, var my form. Document, I'm going to use my document query selector method to get the form. There's only one on the page, so I don't have to do anything special there. If I had multiple forms, I could give it an ID, and then I could get it by the ID, and that would be fine too. But since I only have one, that's kind of nice and easy. And that's great. That gets me my form. And then I'm going to put an event listener on that form. My form dot add event listener. And the event that I'm going to look for this time is the submission of the form. Submit, if I could spell it right. Before, we looked for a click, and often we want to capture clicking of things. But in this case, we want to capture the submission of the form. So I'm going to look for a submit, and then I'm going to run a function when the form is submitted. I'm going to put an extra space here to make it really clear that these things are in here, okay? So we're looking for a submit, and then we're going to run a function. Put a semicolon there. And then what I'm going to do is going to go inside the function here. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do is I want to stop the normal submitting of the form. I want to do something other than that. So I'm going to pass in my event object here. In this case, I'm just going to use E as a shortcut. And then down here, I can do e.preventDefault. Now, this could be event or EVT. Sometimes E is confused with error, so maybe being a little bit more explicit is better. But this should still work just fine. Okay, so I'm going to prevent the default submission of the form. Great, so we got that working. Next, I'm going to actually get the value that somebody types in this field up here. And I'm just going to alert it back to them. It's not very exciting, but it gives me kind of an idea of something I could do. So I'm going to do var form data equals document.querySelector, and I'm going to just do input. In this case, because this will actually go and find the first input, it's going to find this input here. And really what I want is the .value. Okay, so I want to get that property, the value property of this input here. Now, if you're not familiar with HTML or not very familiar with it, I can add a value here, value equals bill. And that will come up by default. But if somebody types a value into the field, then that default value would be replaced with whatever they type into the field. So I'm getting that value property. Since I'm not adding the property there explicitly, it'll be whatever somebody types into the field. Okay, so then I can just alert form data. And now if we go try this, I need to open my file again. Events, open, here it is. And if I type something in here, bill, and submit, you'll see it says bill. And the form data is not processed. The prevent default has kept this from happening. So if I comment this out for a second, watch what happens here. Refresh this. If I type bill again, and now if I click submit, you'll notice it does that, but then it actually processes the form. And I can see that up here because I use the get variable. I use the get method. It's actually putting the value that I typed into that field up in the URL. By default, a form element, when you submit it, the default behavior is that it will go to whatever you set the action here. If I had an action equals processor.php, some other file that's going to process the data, it would go to that page, or it would try to. In this case, it won't be able to because that page doesn't exist. If I do bill, submit, it's going to do that. And then it's going to go look for processor.php, but that page doesn't exist. So it either tries to go there, or it just refreshes. If I don't put an action attribute up here, it will just refresh this page. And often I don't want to refresh the page. I want to use JavaScript to capture this data and do something with it. So that's why I'm doing prevent default down here. And I'm passing in this event. And E, again, is a little bit unclear. Maybe use EVT instead if you want to keep it short. And that will pass in that event object and prevent the default behavior so that we can do what we want to do with JavaScript in here. It's very useful, very, very useful. You know how to work with the click event, and now you know how to work with the submit event. Now we can have some fun with mouse over and mouse out events in HTML and with JavaScript. So this is the HTML here. So create a page with this HTML in here, and all I have is an H1 that says roll your mouse over the boxes and a div here. And we can roll our mouse over these two elements. And what we're going to do here, I'll give you a second. You can pause this video and add this into a file. Make sure you add the style with the div and set the width and the height to 50 pixels and the background color to red so that we can apply this style and do some fun stuff with mouse over and mouse out. And now let's take a look at the script we can actually write to do this here. So let's go ahead and do this over here. So to begin with, I'm going to make some variables for my heading and for the box to get those two elements. So let's start with that. So down here in my script, var heading equals document dot query selector h1 and var div or my div equals document dot query selector div. So that will get those two elements there. I also want to change this text to roll your mouse over the box. Let's do that. And then let's just go see what this page is looking like. If I come over here and refresh this, I have a box and I have directions to roll my mouse over the box. So now I'm going to put an event listener on the box so that when I roll my mouse over the box, it's going to change the inner HTML of this div right here. So we're going to add this here, box add event listener. When we mouse over the box, we're going to change the inner HTML for the heading. The mouse is over the box. So let's do that one. Box dot add event listener. I guess I should have called this box to make this match my slide. Add event listener. And we're looking for a mouse over event. And then when that happens, we're going to run a function. Like so. We'll put the cursor in here and then we're going to say, okay, when we roll over that box, we're going to go get the heading and change its inner HTML. And remember, that's a property, so we use the equal sign, and we're going to change it to something like the mouse is over the box. Let's see if that works. Let's test that. I'm going to come back to my page over here. Refresh. When I roll over the box, the mouse is over the box. Great, so that works, but now it's stuck there. It's changed that content. So now I want to do something where when I mouse out of the box, I'm going to change the heading to the mouse has left the box. So it's another, I'm adding two event listeners to box, both mouse over and mouse out. And this is part of the power of using the add event listener method, is that we can have multiple, we can be listening for multiple events on one object, which is really kind of handy. So let's do that. I'm going to come back here, and rather than type this all from scratch, I'm just going to copy, paste, change this to mouse out. The mouse has left the box. Cool, that's great. Let's go give that a try. Roll your mouse over the box, so the mouse is over the box. When I leave the box, the mouse has left the box. Mouse is over the box, the mouse has left the box. So I can go back and forth. But it'd be kind of nice if I could return the page to its default state without having to click the refresh button. And so I'm going to add one more event listener for the header, so when I roll over the header, it puts the original text back in there, like this. Roll your mouse over the box. I have boxes there, but really there's one box. So let's just fix that right here. And I'm just going to copy this and paste it. But I'm no longer working with box. I'm going to put it on heading. Add event listener, mouse over, and I'm going to put the same text that I have here in here for the heading to put it back to its default state of where it was before. Let's give that one last try, see if it's all working right. Oops. Refresh the wrong page there. But now I can roll over the box, roll off it, and the event listeners are working. If I roll over the header, it puts it back to its original state. So this is a really great example of how we can use event listeners and mouse over and mouse out to change content on the page. Plus, you're making use of the inner HTML property, that element property, that's taking that element and actually replacing the HTML inside of it with something else, which is really, really very powerful and kind of fun. So now you're starting to see we can actually do some interesting things to web pages, and we're no longer just putting stuff in the console. The next event type that we can look at capturing are scroll events. So change the HTML on the page that we just had to something like this. I've just changed the height to 5,000 pixels and for this div that's on the page. So I've got capturing scroll events and just an empty div that's set to 5,000 pixels high. And I've set it to 5,000 pixels high so we have something to scroll. Otherwise, there's nothing to really scroll, and we can't really capture that event. Okay, great. So once you've got that in place, and you can pause this and go ahead and put that in there so that you've got that HTML in place and that CSS in place. Once you've done that, we can go ahead and take a look at the script for capturing scroll events. And here we go. So I've got a script here, and it's really pretty simple. It's a pretty simple script, but we're going to capture the scroll event and see what we can do with it. So let's try this out. Over here in my script, the first thing I'm going to do is create a variable called page top. And this variable is undefined at this moment. I've created a variable page top. And then I'm going to create an event listener. And the event listener in this case is going to go on the window object. So I can actually do window.add event listener. So I can listen for events for the window, and I can listen for a scroll event. And then I'm going to run a function when the scroll event happens. Okay, so we've got a function that's going to run here. And what I want to do here is I want to take page top and update its value. It started out as no value at all, but I'm going to update the value of page top. Page top is going to be equal to window page Y offset. So we're going to set it to that. And then I'm just going to console log out page top. For now, just so we can kind of see what's going on as we're scrolling the page. So a couple of things you might be wondering. One is, why am I defining the variable here? I could just put var there, but let's stick with this for the moment, and then I'll come back and answer that question once we see what this does. I'm going to go over to my browser over here, and here's my page. I'm going to refresh that. And here's my div that's 5,000 pixels tall. I have my inspector open and the console selected over here, so I can actually see as I scroll my page, it's capturing that thing here, but it's not working right. I can see that the script is firing, but my 0 is not changing here. What did I do as a mistake? Let's go take a look at my code. This is a really great example of something that I did wrong here. And This happens all the time. This will happen to you. Don't feel bad. I'm kind of glad this kind of thing happens here. Notice I set page X offset. That's going to keep track of whether the page is moving horizontally or, moving left and right horizontally. Page Y offset was the one that I wanted. And you may have caught that as I was saying it earlier that I had typed in the wrong thing there. But I'm going to change that to page Y offset here. And now let's go see if that works properly. Come back here, refresh my page, and you'll notice as I scroll, it's telling me how many pixels down I've scrolled. I can scroll down, or I could scroll up. And you'll notice as I scroll up, the numbers will get smaller because the page Y offset is telling me how far from the top of the page am I down the page here. And I should be able to go down to 5,000 because I made my element 5,000 pixels. Not quite 5,000 tall there, but you get the idea. Now, one thing to note here is that this event listener is firing very, very often. A couple things to note. It's firing very, very often. It's firing every time I scroll just a little bit. This event listener is going 1, 2, 3, boom. Every single time I scroll just a little bit, it's firing that event listener. So that makes the scroll event listener very expensive in terms of processing and the kinds of things that JavaScript is doing. So you need to be very careful with the window add event listener scroll event because it's going to fire frequently. That brings me back to this. I could have just put var page top here instead of defining it here. But every time I scroll just a tiny little bit, it's going to recreate, it's going to ask JavaScript to recreate the page top variable from scratch and then assign a value to it. Whereas if I do it up here, it's a little bit less expensive because now I'm just updating the value of page top. I create the variable once and then update the variable as I scroll down the page. It's not a big difference. You're not going to notice a huge difference in this example, but it's kind of important to mention because when we talk about creating events that are about scrolling the page, we need to be really careful about what we're asking JavaScript to do because your page can get bogged down really quickly, keeping track of all of these scroll events that are happening. And there are some techniques you can use to sort of mitigate the effects of that. And we'll look at some of those later in this course. Okay, but for right now, all I want you to be really aware of is that we can actually capture the scrolling of the window in this way that's very effective here. If I scroll back up to the top and refresh and scroll down, you'll see it's capturing those numbers. So this is actually a really effective way of doing it. One last thing I want to mention while we're here about the scroll event is notice it doesn't capture every single pixel. If I scroll slowly enough, I'll capture a lot of them, but you can see I've missed a few of them in there. If I scroll really fast, it will skip lots of them more frequently. So that's another thing to pay attention to. If you're looking for a very specific pixel, it's harder to get with the scroll event. Another simple example that we can look at is watching for a resize of the window. And this is useful in responsive design. So let's take a look at this one really quickly as well. I have an H1 here, resize the window. I don't need my div anymore. I can get rid of that. And I can also get rid of my style tag up here. Get rid of the whole style tag. We don't really need that anymore either. But down here, I can actually do another window.add event listener. But in this case, the event we're going to look for is a resize. I'm looking for a resize of the window. And then we'll run a function. And then I'm just going to add 2 console log statements in here so I can watch for resizing both the width and the height of the window. So I'm going to do console.log parentheses, and in here I'm going to use my tick marks and put in here the window width is, I think it's window.inner width. Is that right? Let me check my slide over here. Window.inner width. Yes, and window.inner height. Window.inner width, and that's a variable, so I'm going to put a $sign and a curly brace, and at the end I put a curly brace. And then I'm going to just copy this console log here so I don't have to type it all again, and paste it in here. Window height is window.inner height. Inner width and inner height are properties that belong to the window. So we can actually get a number of pixels for the window with this, and that will actually work pretty nicely. So those are a couple more properties to add to your list of things, list of properties that you know about. So I can come over here and go to my events page. I'm going to refresh this. And if I actually pull this off of here, and let me see if I can position it just right here. There we go. And then I'm going to resize this window. And as I do that, you can see that I'm getting some comments over here about how wide and how width. Window height is undefined. Well, I did something wrong with my window inner height. Let's go see what I did wrong over there. Window inner height with a capital H. There we go. That happens to the best of us. And now let's try it again. All right, so now I'm getting, the width is changing because I'm changing the width here. And then if I come down here and change the height, you can see the height is changing. So there we go. We have a tool that we can use to find out how wide our window is and how tall our window is. And this is extremely useful in JavaScript. And the resize event can be very useful too if you're doing something with responsive design. The next type of event that we're going to capture is when you've pressed a key on your keyboard. So that's kind of interesting that we can capture that. Imagine creating games that you could play where you're pressing keys on your keyboard and things happen in the browser or something like that. That would be kind of fun. So over here on your HTML page, we can just add a script. And this time we're going to actually attach the event listener to the document itself. So let's just do that. That's kind of a really simple thing to do. So let's come over here, and I've got key down event, press a key, and I'm going to actually say document.addEventListener. And in here, I'm going to look for a key down event. You could also look for key up or some other types of events that have to do with keys as well. Function. And then I'm just going to alert a key was pressed. Okay, great. So let's go over and give that a try over here. If I refresh this page and press a key, I get a key was pressed. That's cool. So that's working great. I can detect when a key was pressed. Now, we can check to see that a key was pressed, but it'd be kind of nice to know which key was pressed. And we can find that out through using the which property on our event. So let's give that a try real quick. So I'm going to pass in here my event object. And then in here, instead of using my quotes, I'm going to use the tick marks and say the event.which key was pressed. An event.which is a variable, so I'm going to put a $sign and a curly brace, and then a curly brace. And let's give that a try. So now when I press the J key, I get the 74 key was pressed. So I'm getting a code that goes with each key. If I press the L key, I get a 76. If I press an A key, I get a 65. So I can do this kind of thing to find this sort of stuff out. Now, what's interesting here is that the which property has been deprecated. I just found out about this recently. And so more recently than I put together this lesson. So this is something that happens with JavaScript and with web stuff in particular, is that things change. And part of learning about the web is getting comfortable with finding out when things change and what to do about it. And from my understanding, the which property was deprecated because keyboard layouts can change a lot all over the world. So they decided that that was not the good way to go. And if you come over here to this MDN page, you can actually find out a lot about the different events. And down here, it'll actually say that the keyboard which key has been deprecated. Now, the reality is that browsers will support it for a long, long time to come. You could certainly use it, but they're saying, you shouldn't use that. You should use event keyboard key instead. So let's give that a try real quick. I'm back here on my page, and I'm going to change which to key, because that's what the MDN says I should do. And they're sort of the most authoritative resource on this stuff. So let's go over and sort of check that out over here. If I refresh my page, if I press the F key, now I'm not only getting not a number, but I'm actually getting the F key was pressed. If I press a Y, I get the Y key was pressed. So that's kind of interesting and useful. We've captured a lot of different types of events now, from the click event to the submission of a form to the mouse over and mouse out and scrolling and capturing keys. There are all types of events, and these are just a few examples. There are plenty more events that you can capture, and you can look up the full list on the Mozilla Developer Network if you want to sort of really poke through them all. But these will keep you busy for quite a while, just these few events. And by capturing these events and combining that with manipulating the page, we can do some really interesting things in our web pages now. And you really have a lot of the basics that you need as a foundation to start building interesting interactive web pages. So we'll be going on from here, and we'll be talking about a few more basic concepts and techniques, and then we'll be practicing a lot of this stuff and building some projects so you can actually try it out. Plus, there's lots of challenges along the way, challenge exercises and challenges within the projects for building stuff. And hopefully you find it fun and are willing to come along with me on this journey and continue to put what you've learned with JavaScript to use in actually making some interesting, fun things.